Okay, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe is currently the political science endowed professor in public policy and public law and co-directs the Climate Center at Texas Tech University. She has authored more than 120 peer-reviewed publications. She has a BS in physics from the University of Toronto and an MS and a PhD in atmospheric sciences from the University of Illinois. She's also received the American Geophysical Union's Climate Communication Prize, the Stephen Schneider Climate Communication Award, the United Nations Champion of the Earth Award, and been named to a number of lists, including Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People, Foreign Policy's 100 Leading Thinkers, and Fortune Magazine's World Greatest Leaders. So how lucky are we to have Dr. Katharine Hayhoe with us today? Hi, Katharine, welcome.
Thank you so much. I have to say, Mark, that was the most impressively quick transition I have ever heard. We are not wasting any time here, people.
Nope.
I am so glad to be with you here today. I am one of CCL's National Science Advisors. I am a climate scientist. I study what climate change means to us at the local scale where we live. So I'm going to be talking to you, but you are also going to be talking to me. And the way I like to do that is through using something called PolEV. So if you don't mind, they're going to put that link in the chat there too, so you can click on it if you want to. If you don't mind, go to polev.com/Katharine, my name. Make sure you have 2 A's in it. And you can do this on your phone, on your computer, on your tablet, on your laptop, on anything that you have that's connected to the internet. It might ask you your name, just push skip. We don't have to collect the names. And when you get to polev.com/Katharine, I'm going to be able to ask you questions. And then you can ask me questions at the end too. So the first question I want to ask you is, I want to ask, where are you joining from today? This is a clickable map. You can click from where you are around the US. And if you are in Canada, I'm Canadian, that's okay. You can just click over the border. Or if you are from somewhere else listening in, just click kind of outside the US in that direction. So it looks like we have a huge representation from the Northeast, either that or you are quicker with your fingers than anyone else. We've got one person from Texas where I live. Yes, I'm in Texas. We've got a bunch from Oklahoma across the middle of the country. That's great. We've got somebody off the coast of Florida who's probably actually in Florida. I know this may be hard to click if you're on a phone. Okay. Oh, it looks like we do have a few in Ontario. All right. Excellent. Okay, we have some coming in there. All right. So this is how PolEV works. And as we go along, I'm going to ask you some questions. And then at the end, you're going to be able to ask me questions using PolEV as well. So before we get started, I have another question for you. And this is a question that I feel like we really need to all be asking each other today. And again, these questions are anonymous, so just answer however you will. And my second question to you is this. In one word, just one word, not two, just one word, how are you feeling right now? One word. Now, oh, okay. So this is a wordle. You see why there had to be one word? It's because if you answer more than one, if more than one people say something like hopeful, then it shows up bigger. All right, we have a huge variety here. We've got all the way from sunshiny and enthused to uneasy and cautious. We've got people who sound like they've had their coffee and people who sound like they haven't. We've got people who are frustrated, others who are encouraged. Some are excited, some are tired. Strangely, I don't see my answer here. Oh, yes, I do. I do see. Here in Texas, people have been cold. I do see that there's one cold here. But overall, people are hopeful and optimistic, excited and anxious and good. There's definitely some overwhelmed and some frustrated too, and I hear you on that. And there's a sense of urgency. All right, let's dig in. So don't lose this because I will be asking you some other questions as we go along, but let's dig in here. Whenever it snows, yes, I have to begin with this. You can't not talk about this past week. Whenever it snows, we have the politicians immediately saying, oh, it's snowing, so where's global warming now? I want to talk about what's been happening in Texas and around a lot of the rest of the US and even up into Southern Ontario this past week. Why did it snow so much? Why has it been so cold? I have 5 reasons, and reason number 1 begins with this: it's winter. There is this thing called winter in the Northern Hemisphere, and yes, it does get cold in winter. Why does winter happen? Winter happens because of the tilt of the Earth's axis of rotation relative to the plane of the orbit around the sun. This is why we have seasons. The second reason we have particularly cold periods sometime is because of natural variability. If you look at global average temperature, you can see that from decade to decade, it might be going up or down or staying the same. But you can see that long-term over climate timescales, it's steadily ticking upwards, even as you can have some years that are cooler and some years that are warmer, right? And when you zoom into a specific location, and I'm going to zoom into where I live, which is Lubbock, Texas right now, you can do this yourself. If you go to Climate at a Glance is the name of the website. If you go to NOAA's Climate at a Glance website, you can do this for your own city. So you can see here in Lubbock, our January average temperature has ranged from just over 30 degrees Fahrenheit, just over 30 degrees, to almost 48 degrees. That is almost a full 20-degree swing in the average January temperature. That's weather. Sometimes you get cold ones, sometimes you get hot ones, right? So does that mean that climate change has nothing to do with it? No, climate change is still here too. Let me explain. First of all, going back to the figure we just saw, climate change is shifting our baseline. It's shifting our perception of what normal winter looks like. What do I mean by that? Well, from 1950s to 1960s, where I live, 9 out of the 20 years were below average temperatures. And some of them were down to 33, 32 degrees. From the 1970s and 80s, we had 12 years below average. But then winter has been warming quicker than any other season in Texas. And this is true across much of the eastern United States, all the way up to New England. So what do you think happened after that? From 1990 to 2010, we had 6 years below average. And from 2010, we have had no years below average. Now, again, this is for January. We're not finished February yet. So we don't even know what a normal winter looks like anymore. And so because of climate change, and so when what used to be a normal winter happens, everybody says, oh my goodness, this winter is so cold. That is one way how climate change is changing our perception of winter. There's 2 other ways though, and this one's a little more counterintuitive, so stay with me. We see that as the world has warmed, heavy precipitation has increased. It's increased most over the Midwest and the Northeast, but we also see it increasing over the Gulf Coast, the Southeast, and beyond. Why is this happening? The scientific explanation is actually very clear. Warmer air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along, there's more water vapor to sweep up and dump on us than there would have been 50 or 100 years ago. Why do I call it precipitation? Not to be all sciencey and all fancy. I call it that because precipitation can be rain, but it can also be what? Ice, snow, sleet, right? Also hail, technically. So what we see is that even sometimes when it's cold enough to snow below freezing, there's still more water vapor in the air. And in fact, along the East Coast, we're not talking about Texas yet, but along the East Coast, what they've seen is that heavy snowfalls have been on the rise even as winters have been warming. So you have warm, 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 and then you have big, giant snowstorm. Warm, 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 big, giant snowstorm. Let me actually show you what's been happening. If you live in DC, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, or Boston, this is showing the 10 biggest snowstorms on record in terms of how much snow they got. So the light green happened anywhere from the 1800s up to 1990. So almost 100 years, the light green. And then the dark green is just the last 30 years. What do you see? You see that a lot more of the really bad snowstorms are happening nowadays compared to back then. And people might say, but it's warmer today. How could you be having bigger snowstorms? That's exactly why we're having bigger snowstorms. It's because warmer air holds more water vapor. And in winter, it is still cold enough to snow on the East Coast. Yes. So when people say, oh, it can't be global warming, I say it absolutely can, but I prefer to call it global weirding, because what's happening is not just that the planet isn't getting warmer, but it is kicking off all kinds of weird weather. So when I started a YouTube series 5 years ago, I wanted to call it what it is, global weirding. And I'm delighted that CCL is a sponsor of this PBS digital series. And in fact, we are going to be putting out season 5 later this year. We're already writing the new episodes. So I'm going to stop here and ask you a question, and it is this. On the global weirding videos on YouTube, have you watched them all and shared them? Have you seen one or two? Or are you just hearing about it for the first time? Okay, it looks like we have lots of first timers, which is awesome. So I'm going to ask Susan, if you don't mind, to put in the chat. I'm going to ask you to put in the chat a link to our global weirding series. It is globalweirdingseries.com. That's literally the website address, globalweirdingseries.com. Or you can go to YouTube and just Google global weirding. It'll show up. And I would love for you to push subscribe. What will you get if you subscribe? As soon as our new episodes come out, you will be notified and you can be the first people to see them, which you should be, since CCL is one of our major sponsors. So click on the link in the chat, go to globalweirdingseries.com, click on subscribe, and you will be able to not only view everything, but share the new ones. We have episodes on almost anything you can imagine, including how climate change is affecting every area of the United States. So it is a very valuable resource for you to watch, for you to share at CCL meetings, for you to post on social media, and for you to use with others who are looking for simple explanations of why we know climate change is real, it's caused by humans, the impacts are affecting us here and now, and there's smart things that we can do about it. And I'm delighted to say that one of our new episodes is going to be talking about policies like carbon pricing, because that's something we didn't have yet in the series. So click on that link. But let's move on, because I have one more really interesting thing to share, which relates more to Texas. Now, you're going to have to follow me here, because this is going to be the most science that we get into. Ready? We have to start this story with the jet stream. The jet stream is a band of very fast winds that circles the planet at high elevation. The jet stream is powered, literally powered, by the temperature difference between the cold Arctic and the warmer air down below. So the bigger the temperature difference between the Arctic and where we live down here, the stronger the jet stream. And the stronger it is, the straighter it is, the faster it just whips around the world. But what's been happening as the planet's been warming the last 100 years? Well, down here, we've warmed by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, which is 2 to 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. But up here, they've been warming more than twice that, 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, which is 3.5 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. So if the Arctic's warming faster, what's happening to the temperature difference? It's going down. What do you think is happening to the jet stream? It's starting to slow down. And on weeks like this past week, where it was 15 degrees Celsius, which is like almost, it's more than 25 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than average in the Arctic, 25 degrees above average in the Arctic last week, what do you think happens to the jet stream? The jet stream slows down and it starts to wiggle, just like a river does on a very flat river plain. It slows down and it starts to wiggle. And so what happens is the cold Arctic air can pour down into those troughs there. And this is exactly what happened this last week. All of that cold air poured down into a trough all the way to Texas. Now, scientists are not 100% sure that these troughs are increasing due to climate change, because even though the Arctic is definitely warming faster, and that definitely slows down the jet stream, there's still some other things going on, and our satellite record is too short to actually tell if there's a definitive trend. So this is really at the cutting edge of climate science. There's some hints that climate change might be affecting this. Another reason to call it global weirding. But when we look at what's happening, people say, well, there's some indication that it is humans and there's some indication that it isn't. So how does this relate to Texas? Well, this kind of cold air outbreak was what prompted the situation in Texas. But why did the situation turn into a disaster? Nothing to do with that cold air outbreak in and of itself. Everything to do with how Texas was completely unprepared. Should they have been unprepared? No, because in 1989, they had a very similar cold wave, icing power outage. And so there was a lot of postmortem. They wrote reports. They said the grid really should be winterized. And the state said, thank you so much. I don't think we're going to enforce that. They said to the grid operators, they said to the power producers, maybe you want to do this. And the power producers, who in Texas are private, said, no, thank you. It would cost us money. So then the same thing happened again in 2011, the same thing. And they had a report, they had a commission, they said, you really need to winterize your natural gas power plants, your natural gas pipelines, your nuclear power plants, and your wind turbines, because wind turbines handle the cold just fine up in Scandinavia, down in Antarctica. They keep the lights on there because they're winterized. But in Texas, because it's a deregulated market, people have been cutting corners and they refused to winterize their equipment because it would cost too much money up front, and the government didn't want to make them do it. So as a result, 13% of the outages were due to frozen wind turbines. 87% of the outages were due to natural gas pipelines and natural gas power plants freezing, and a small contribution from a nuclear power plant also freezing. Yes, why did they freeze? They didn't freeze because Texas had never seen this cold weather before. We had. They didn't freeze because you can't operate gas pipelines, gas power plants, and wind turbines at freezing weather. You can. They froze because they were not appropriately winterized, which begs this question. If people can't prepare for the weather extremes we already have today, how are they going to prepare for what's coming with climate change? We know that we already have billion-dollar weather climate disasters wherever we live, and Texas has more than anyone because we get every type of disaster. We get wildfires, droughts, floods, hurricanes, ice storms, blizzards, haboobs, big dust storms, severe weather, tornadoes, heat waves. Texas gets pretty much everything, but wherever you live, you get these weather and climate disasters naturally. What we see is that they are increasing in frequency. In fact, hidden in the COVID news last month was this press release from NOAA, that said 2020 sets a new annual record of $22 billion weather and climate events, shattering the previous annual record of 16 events that occurred in 2011 and 2017. And 2020 was the 6th consecutive year with 10 or more billion-dollar weather events. Why are these happening? Because we are not prepared for what happens today, let alone what's going to happen tomorrow. The way I think about climate risk is like this. It's as if we have a pair of dice and we always have a chance of rolling a double six. That is our naturally occurring weather and climate disaster. If we live in Texas, we already have 3 6s on our dice naturally. So if this is natural, where does climate change come in? Climate change comes in by sneaking in when we're not looking and taking one of these numbers and then another of these numbers and turning them into 6s too. So all of a sudden we're having 3 500-year flood events in 3 years in Houston. And people are saying, how could we have 3 500-year flood events in 3 years? It's global weirding. Climate change is loading the dice against us. But then it sneaks in and it adds a 7 where we have Hurricane Harvey with over 50 inches of rain in some places. How could that happen? Climate change is loading the dice against us. As the US military says, climate change is a threat multiplier. It doesn't create new events we've never seen before. It takes things that we already know about and it makes them worse. So the question is not, did climate change cause this event? That's not the question. The question is, did climate change make it worse? And often, not always, but often the answer is yes. If you want to know more about this question, it's a scientific area called attribution, where scientists are actually putting numbers on it. Like we can say that almost 40% of the rain that fell during Hurricane Harvey wouldn't have happened if the same hurricane had occurred 100 years ago. This is called attribution. And this is a fantastic book that just came out last September. I don't know, Susan, if you're able to put a link to this book in the chat for people. It is by a leading climate scientist called Ferdy Otto, and she explains in very simple language. It's very readable. It's not a scientific textbook. She tells lots of stories and she explains things very clearly. She talks about how climate change is making our weather weirder and worse. But moving on. So what exactly is happening? We've already talked about how heavy precipitation is becoming more intense and more frequent because warmer air holds more water vapor. Also, we see that heat waves have become more intense and more frequent in the summer, even though, of course, we still do get cold waves because it's winter and because of natural variability and because we don't know what cold feels like anymore and because climate change is increasing the heavy snowfall, especially on the East Coast. And there may be, we're not sure, but there may be a link to the warming Arctic and the Arctic air outbreaks as the jet stream slows down and gets wavier. So we still get cold waves and we still get snow, but our summer heat waves are getting a lot worse. We know that heavy precipitation is increasing, like I said. How else is climate change loading the dice against us? Let me just give you a couple more ways. Oh, we already talked about this too. Yes, just to remind you again that heavy precipitation is not just rain, it is also ice, snow. So we also see that our droughts are getting stronger. Now, how could you have heavy rainfall and droughts? Well, it's like we always have this natural variability, you know, wet, dry, wet, dry, wet, dry. Climate change is stretching it in both directions. So as we have more water evaporating into the atmosphere, if a storm comes along and picks it up and dumps it on us, we have more heavy rainfall. But a high pressure system sitting over the region, which is what a drought is, a high pressure system directs storms away from the region. A storm comes up to the high pressure system and it gets pushed away from the region. So there's no storm to pick up all that water vapor and dump it on us. So instead, it just gets hotter and drier. We have both at the same time. We see that forest fires are not getting more frequent, but they are burning a lot more area. How is climate change coming into this? Well, in the Western US, the majority of wildfires are accidental human ignition. That's right. Only 7% of the big fires in California have been deliberate arson. Most of them are accidental. Like what? Like dumping a load of burning trash into the dry brush, or an electric power line shorting out and starting a fire, or somebody leaving an old appliance plugged in their shed and it shorts out, burns down the shed, the house, the neighborhood, and starts a wildfire. Or gender reveal party fireworks. These are all real reasons why really big wildfires have started in California. So obviously these things have nothing to do with climate change. So where does climate change come in? Well, imagine you have a pile of green wood and you drop a match into the green wood. What happens? Not much. Imagine you have a pile of bone dry kindling and you drop a match into that. What happens? A conflagration. That's climate change. Climate change is drying out the soil and the vegetation so that when the match gets dropped, so to speak, we end up seeing something like this. Remember this in the news a little while ago? Or a year ago, remember this? The bushfires in Australia. In the National Climate Assessment, we looked at this and we found that without climate change, wildfires would have burned about 11 million acres in the Western United States from the 1980s to 2015. But with climate change, they actually burned more than double the area. That's climate change loading the dice against us. And CAL FIRE put out this really stunning graphic just a few months ago that showed the 20 largest wildfires since 1930. 3 of them happened before 2000. All of the blue ones happened from 2000 to 2019, and the red ones were 2020 alone. The size of the pie shows how big each fire was. This, again, is climate change loading the dice against us. Well, we haven't even touched on hurricanes, so let me do that briefly. We are not seeing more frequent hurricanes, but hurricanes get their energy from warm ocean water, and the oceans are warming. So first of all, we see that they have a lot more rainfall because there's more water vapor for them to sweep up and dump on us, and hurricanes are very big storms. But because they're plugged into a warming ocean, they are intensifying faster. We see the same number overall, but of that number, more of them are stronger now than they used to be. So same number, but more are stronger. We see that they're moving more slowly, they're getting bigger, and of course, sea levels rising, so that's making their storm surge even worse. Wherever we live, climate change is taking the risks we already face today, like droughts, dust storms, hurricanes, and floods, and making them worse. If we live in California, it's taking air pollution, droughts, wildfires, making it worse. Wherever we live, climate change is taking what's already on our dice, so to speak, and amplifying or magnifying it, making it worse. If we live along the coastlines, we see that sea level is threatening our cities. Miami Beach is raising the level of their streets by 2 feet. Sea level rise has already reduced Carolina beach properties by $1.5 billion. In Florida, they estimate that coastal homes could lose 15% of their value due to climate change. Climate change is a threat multiplier that exacerbates all of the risks we already face today. We often think that we have a priority list, and today it's surviving COVID and its effects, worrying about everybody I love, feeding my family, keeping up with my job or just keeping it, paying the bills, planning for the future. And then here's doing something about climate change down at number 29 or 35 or 52. And we feel like we have to push it up people's lists. Now, listen very carefully. This is really important. I'm a climate scientist. So you would think that doing something about climate change would be number 1 or number 2 on my list, right? I don't think this should be on anybody's priority list at all. You heard me right. Don't hang up though. I don't think it should be on anybody's priority list at all. And here's why. Why do I care about climate change? I care about climate change because, not because it's warming the entire planet by 3 or 4 degrees. I care about it because that affects our health. It affects everyone I love. It affects the food that we eat, the air we breathe, the water we drink. It affects our jobs and our well-being. It affects the economy and our ability to pay our bills. It affects our future. You get the picture here? We don't have to try to force climate action up people's lists. We just have to figure out what is at the top of their list already and then connect climate change to it. And that's a lot easier to do. So I'm going to ask you now, we're going back to polev.com/Katharine. And I want one word from you. I care about climate change because it affects our or my what? And I don't want to see global temperature on this at all because nobody cares because of that. There's nothing more abstract than global temperature. Why do you care about climate change? Because it affects my what? Exactly. It affects my food. It affects my family, my children, my grandchildren, our future, nature, snow. Oh, I like maple. Yes, definitely. It does affect maple trees. It affects our reefs, our parks. It affects our faith, our homes, our security. It affects our sleep. Yes, it does affect our sleep. It affects our security, our budget, our mental health. Yes, it affects everything. I mean, isn't this just everything? So here's the thing. When you're talking to somebody who says they don't care about climate change, do you think they care about their future? Probably. Do they care about their children and their family and their grandchildren? Probably. Do they care about their budget? And do they care about the place where they live? Do they care about the things they enjoy doing? Yes. So if they don't think they care about climate change, it's not because you have to make them care about climate change. You just have to connect the dots to why they already care about climate change. They just didn't realize it. Let me repeat that. They already care, they just didn't realize it. That is a very different way to talk about climate change than assuming that they don't care, because you're assuming if they don't care, you're assuming that they don't have the right values. And it's hard to have a conversation that starts from the assumption that they don't care without bringing some judgment into it. And we are very sensitive to judgment. And if we feel somebody's judging us, we tend to turn off. So rather than judging each other, assume that if we just understood, we would care, and start from there. When it comes to climate change, we have two big problems. We have the problem of psychological distance and the problem of political polarization. What is psychological distance? It's the idea that we see climate change as distant in time, the future, not now, distant in space, over there, not here, abstract, global temperature, rather than here, a stronger hurricane or snowstorm or heat wave. And we see it as irrelevant to our primary concerns. It matters to the polar bears, it matters to tree huggers, but it doesn't matter to me. We see this in the polling data from the Yale program on climate communication. This shows public opinion by county. Anywhere that's orange is greater than 50% of people say yes. If less than 50% say yes, it's blue. So do you think global warming is happening? Sure, yes. Do you think it's going to harm plants and animals? Far away in relevance. Yes. Do you think it will harm future generations? Far away in time? Yes. Do you think it will harm people in developing countries? Far away in space? Yes. Do you think it will harm, do you see what we're doing though? We're getting a bit closer to home with each one, and the colors are getting lighter each time. Do you think it will harm people in the US? Probably, but definitely a lot lighter. And then they said, do you think it will harm you? No, people don't think it will harm them. Why? Because we see it as distant in time, distant in space, distant in relevance, and we see it as abstract rather than concrete. So when a senator brings a snowball into the floor of the Senate to say, here's a snowball, there's no global warming, that snowball is here, it is now, and it is not abstract, it's concrete. And this was a very powerful piece of messaging compared to showing pictures of polar bears in the Arctic and Siberia. So our first problem is psychological distance, but our second problem is political polarization. And in February, climate change and environmental protection topped the list of the most politically polarized issues in the whole US. Right up there at the top, the width of the gray bar indicates how politically polarized it is. The wider the bar, the more polarized it is. Well, of course, COVID happened. And what happened with COVID? What happened with climate change? They surveyed people again in August, and here's what they found. This time it's not ranked by the width of the gray bar, so I'm going to point out the three widest gray bars. Number 3 is COVID. Yeah, that became politically polarized very quickly. Number 2 is race and ethnic inequality. And number 1 is climate change, still. So how do we tackle these two problems? Interestingly, Chris Chu, who is one of my colleagues at Texas Tech University, his research has found the answer. He found that both our political polarization and our psychological distance are reduced when we bring climate change here and now. So when we talk about what is happening here and what is happening now, and remember, I have a global weirding episode for every part of the US. So if you don't know how to talk about what's here and what's now, just go to globalweirdingseries.com, find the episode for your part of the US and watch it. And you'll have lots of talking points. He says when we bring it close, that's what shows us that it's real and it matters. Isn't that interesting? And how do we do that? How do we bring it close? Well, going back to these same maps, they have the answer. We left off here. This is the one we left off. Do you think global warming will harm us? We say no. But then they said, do you ever hear anybody talk about it? This is darker blue. Only a third of people in the country hear somebody else talk about it, even occasionally. And then they said, do you ever hear about it in the media? And the answer is no. Well, what's the connection? If we don't talk about it, why would anybody care? And if we don't care, why would we ever want to do anything about it? Why don't we talk about it? We don't think it matters to us, and we don't think there's anything positive that we can do to fix it. So what we do is this. It's a vicious cycle. This is what not to do. Climate changes, we get worried. We share more scary data because if other people aren't worried, they should be worried. But what happens is people reject it even more, and inaction results. Because as neuroscientist Tali Sharot says, she says, fear and anxiety cause us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action. So scaring people actually solidifies inaction and climate changes more. So how do we break this vicious cycle? By talking about how climate change matters to us, not the polar bears, not the Arctic, not an existential threat to humanity as we know it, but why and how climate change matters to us and all the positive things that we can do to fix it, which is what CCL is all about, right? So climate changes and we get worried, as we should, but what do? Here's where you break the cycle. Watch carefully. Instead of dumping scary data on people, share how it affects us and positive solutions that we can engage in at every level, from an individual level to our place of work, to our place of worship, to the city or town that we're in, to national policy like pricing carbon. Present an array of solutions at different scales. And what happens is people feel empowered. They feel like, okay, there's a problem and it matters to me and I can do something about it. So action results. And what neuroscientist Tali Sharot says is, she says, our brain is literally built to associate forward action with a reward, not avoiding harm. So reframe your message so the information you provide will induce hope, not dread. Think back to when I asked you how you feel. Hopeful? If we are able to communicate this to people, and hopeful is not false hope. Hopeful doesn't mean that we are like, oh, everything's fine. It's not fine. Everything is not fine. Hope begins from a dark place. Hope is the bright light at the end of the dark tunnel. That's what hope is. And so we can't sugarcoat the fact that we have a very serious situation. We need to act as soon as possible. But the hope comes in that by acting, we can make a difference. And as a climate scientist, I can tell you that is absolutely true. Our actions are the #1 determinant of how much climate will change in the future. So there absolutely is hope. Our choices do make a difference. But they begin from a place of recognizing how it is bad, it is serious, but we can fix it. So talking about it is so interesting because when we talk about something, it changes who we see ourselves as. It changes what people around us think. It changes what we view to be normal in our society. Isn't that interesting? And that changes also what social scientists say is the #1 barrier to acting, which is we don't feel like we can make a difference. We feel like we have no efficacy. But talking about what people are doing and what others can join us in doing, it creates efficacy, and that allows us to be able and willing to act. We might think conversation sounds trivial, but it isn't. It's so important. And in that conversation, we start by bonding over something we share, by connecting to reduce the psychological distance, and by inspiring to address the fact that most people don't think that there's bipartisan solutions to fix climate change. How do we bond with people? We can bond over the place we live, our family, a shared faith, an activity we enjoy. If you used to be in the military, if you remember the same club. I bond with people over being a mom, over living in Texas, over being a Canadian, over being a Christian, over being somebody who loves to ski. Bond with people over who you are. So here's my last question to you. And we're almost done now, and I'll be taking your questions to me when I'm done. But my last question to you is this. I care about climate change because I am a what? If you have to use more than one word, make sure you use a dot to join them because, as you know, this is a Wordle. But why do you care about climate change? I love this because these are different words, right? So we care because we are a grandparent or a nature lover, a student, a capitalist, I love that, a geologist, a Christian, a mother, a runner, a person of color, a global citizen, an architect, a nature lover, a birder, yes. Allergic to poison ivy, that's a very good one, yes. A skier, a horsewoman, a compassionate person, an archaeologist. I don't think I've ever seen that before, and that's a great one. You understand how even small variations have really affected humans in the past. This is such an awesome list. I'm going to post this list on Twitter if you want to get it later. So look at the variety here. Look at the variety that's on this list. We have pretty much everybody on this list, don't we? Why do you care? It's because who you already are is the perfect person to care. And carry that message with you as you talk to others, because that means who they are is also the perfect person to care. And if they don't care, it's because they haven't connected the dots. We can talk about how climate change affects our health or our kids, our jobs, our transportation, our safety, the places where we live. There are so many things we can talk about that connect to who people already are. And we cannot neglect talking about solutions. In addition to national policy, it is very encouraging to have stories about solutions that are happening in the place where you live. Like in Texas, we have the biggest Army base in the US that's 43% powered by wind and solar energy and going up every year. We have the first carbon neutral airport in North America. We have 23% of our energy produced by wind energy already. Find stories about what is already happening in the places where you live and share those stories. We can talk about what is happening with big corporations in industry. We can talk about what is happening in faith communities of all kinds. Interfaith Power and Light is a great resource to learn what's happening in faith communities of all kinds. We can talk about what's happening around the world, where 90% of new energy installed in 2020 was clean energy. 90%, much of that in parts of the world that don't have access to fossil fuels. If you lack solutions to talk about, go to Project Drawdown. The link is drawdown.org if you don't mind putting that in the chat. They have over 100 solutions that you can learn about and you can share with people. Have those conversations. This was not my TED Talk. Watch my TED Talk if you want more hints on how to have a conversation. And when you have that conversation, you want to start by bonding over something you share, connecting to address psychological distance, and inspiring to address the idea that people don't think there's anything we can do to fix it. And I want to end with one story, and then I'll be taking a few of your questions. This is a story about Glenn. This is Glenn. My TED Talk came out in December 2018. In May 2019, 5 months later, I was in London for one of the trips where I collect all my invitations for 2 years in advance, and I go to one place and I do like 20 different talks in the same place to minimize my carbon footprint. I do most of my talks virtually already though, pre-COVID. But I went finally to London to do one of these bundled trips. And after one of my talks at the London School of Economics, Glenn came up to me and said, "I saw your TED Talk. I live in Wandsworth, population about 380,000. And he said, we've been so frustrated that we haven't been getting any climate action. So I decided to have conversations like you said. I just decided to have conversations and to encourage other people to have conversations." So he said, "I have a list of how many conversations we've had the last 5 months. Would you like to see it?" I said, "Sure." I expected maybe 75 or 80 names. He reaches in his bag and he pulls out 10,000 names. 10,000 people had a conversation about climate change in his town of 380,000 people. And as a result, they declared a climate emergency and they continue to invest millions of pounds in their climate action plan that includes energy efficiency, air quality, waste management, green spaces, sustainable development, and sustainable transportation. And how did this begin? With a conversation. So do not feel like talking is like a cop-out or the least you can do. Talking is the first thing that you can do that truly makes a difference, explaining how climate change matters to us and what we can do to fix it. The number one best person to do this is not me, it's you. Friends and family are the most trusted messengers on climate change. Thank you. Now, we're going to take your questions. We have exactly 7 minutes for questions. So here's the really fun thing. You can type in your full question here, but you can also go and you can upvote the questions you most want me to answer. So even if you don't have a question, go ahead to polev.com and look at the questions other people have put and upvote the questions that you most want me to answer in the 7 minutes that we have. If you go to PoleAV and you click on top, here it is what it looks like on your phone, click on top, you can see the questions ranked in order. Okay, actually the one that's getting downvoted, I'm gonna go ahead and answer that one. Why do you still live in Texas? It's because it is the most vulnerable place. And I am not gonna be retiring here, I'm sorry to say, I'm not, because it is very vulnerable. But I am here because this is the place where people need this information the most. So lots of great questions. I'm going to go through these as many as I can. Here we go. Ready? This is the speed round, and you are helping me enormously because you're writing and you're upvoting. So keep upvoting as we go. How does soil degradation from conventional farming affect climate change and the local weather? Well, it's not so much soil degradation, it's more all of the nitrogen fertilizers that are used because they produce N2O, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas, and livestock produces a lot of methane, which is another very powerful greenhouse gas. But good conservation agriculture not only conserves soil, it can put carbon back in the ground. So I would encourage you to check out a couple of resources. Check out Kiss the Ground, a book and a movie, and check out the work that Project Drawdown talks about with soil conservation, and check out the work that Matt Russell, who is a farmer, is doing with Interfaith Power and Light in the state of Iowa. So Kiss the Ground, Matt Russell, and Project Drawdown. Have I been invited to address Congress? Yes, I've actually been invited quite a few times. And I finally went a year ago last June. And the experience was so negative that my policy is not to do that again. Why? Because they wouldn't listen to a woman. None of the Republican members would listen to a woman. They called me young lady and miss. And well, they referred to the other people on the panel, whether they're older or younger than me, as Dr. So-and-so. So I think that addressing Congress is effective, but really I want people to listen to what's being said. And so now when I'm asked to address Congress, I say, why don't you listen to this other person who is a man, because I want you to listen. Now, they should be listening to a woman, don't get me wrong. They absolutely should. But we don't have time to fix their attitudes. We need to move ahead ASAP. So whoever is the best messenger to get through to people, I am all for using the best messenger. Green actions. I've heard they don't make much of a difference. Well, the answer to that is yes and no. Here's how. Individually, they don't. If all you do is cut your own personal carbon footprint, even if everybody in the US who was alarmed about climate change cut their personal carbon footprint in half, that would only be 15% of individual emissions. And our choices only control 40%. So 15% of 40%, that's all that would be accomplished by everybody who's alarmed about climate change, cutting their personal carbon footprint 50%. So does that mean it doesn't matter? No, it does matter, because when we act, and listen very carefully, when we act and we talk about it, we are changing social norms. When we get solar panels and talk about how excited we are, the number one reason why people in a certain neighborhood have solar panels is if one person got them first. It is literally contagious. Solar energy is contagious. If people start reducing their food waste, it's because somebody told them about it. If somebody gets an electric vehicle, it's because somebody they know had one and said, hey, it's really cool. Would you like to check mine out? I got it used. It wasn't that expensive. Here's where you could get yours too. So as an individual, the most powerful thing we can do is use our voice. And part of what we can use our voice to talk about is what we've done to change our social norms and to make it contagious. So do not neglect doing that. And just imagine this. Imagine if Greta Thunberg had reduced her whole family's carbon footprint to almost nothing, but she had never taken a piece of white paper and painted a few words on it and gone and sat outside a building. Would anybody know her name? No, nobody would know her name. The reason we know her name is because she used her voice to advocate for change. And that is how every single individual can make the hugest difference in the world, by sharing why climate change matters to us and what we can do to fix it at every level, from reducing our personal carbon footprint to putting a price on carbon at the national scale. There's a whole spectrum of actions, and this is so important to talk about these. What countries are doing the best job to address climate change? The Climate Action Tracker, if you Google Climate Action Tracker, it'll show you, and Bhutan is at the top of the list. They are actually reforesting so much of the country that they're carbon negative. Costa Rica is doing excellent also, and other countries are starting to catch up. For example, as you probably know, in Canada, there's been a federal price on carbon, and the government just announced they were going to up it, so it would finally be consistent with the Paris target. It's going to be increasing at $15 a year starting next year until it hits $130 a ton. The number one solution to climate change is for individuals is to talk about it. But for us humans, there isn't one solution. There's hundreds of solutions. There's technology solutions, there's lifestyle solutions, there's agriculture solutions, there's conservation solutions. There's all kinds of solutions, and Project Drawdown talks about them all, so check that out. The single best action that a CCL member can take, and this is a good one to end with. And below that, I see recommendations for bridging gaps. That's my TED Talk. So watch my TED Talk on that. What's the single best action a single person can do? As Bill McKibben would say, the best thing an individual can do right now is not be such an individual. What did he mean by that? He meant don't seal yourself off from the rest of society. He means use your connections in society to engage. In addition to being a human, you are also part of a family. You are also part of a place of work or a place of study. You may be part of a place of worship. You may be part of a social organization like a Rotary Club. You are definitely part of a community. You're probably part of a city or a town. You're certainly part of a state. So use your voice to advocate for change in the circles in which you find yourself, and don't neglect the local. Did you know there's 500,000 elected officials, 500,000, 0.1% of them are federal. Those are the ones that you can't really get in and have coffee with on an easy basis. But that means that 99.9% of people you could have a conversation with. And you really can make a difference in your sphere of influence. And it's the single best thing that anybody can do, CCL member or not, is have those conversations that talk about why it matters to all of us, why we already care, even if you didn't realize it, and what is the whole range of things we can do from the federal level, something like carbon pricing, to what we might be able to do at the city level, at the level of our organization, at the level of our individual homes, because making people feel like there is a solution is the number one way to guarantee that there will be a solution. Thank you so much. This has been absolutely wonderful. And I want to leave you with two things. Mark, I still need to talk to you about this because I want to talk more about Science Moms with CCL. But I'm part of this great organization that is all about getting the moms involved in climate change. So if you're a mom, or you know somebody who's a mom or a grandma or an auntie, or we've had a few uncles and dads sign up to, this is a resource that we provide to people so that they can figure out what they can do about climate change. And I want to make a big announcement. And this is the first time I've announced this anywhere. I have a new book coming out that actually talks about what I was talking about at the end. It talks about that whole idea of being contagious and how we as individuals can make a difference. It is going to be released in September. It is already at Amazon. I haven't announced it to anybody, but I'm announcing it to you right now. If you want to go ahead and pre-order it, you can. And I'm super excited that it's going to be coming out again, like I said, in September. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.